Hi, my name is Rod Main, and thanks for watching this video. Today, I want to talk about part one in the speaking test for the IELTS exam, and I want to talk about it in detail. I'll also be talking about the examiner's role, what the examiner is expected to do, what rules there are for that person, and I want to tell people about the strategy they should be using when they go into the part one of the IELTS speaking test. The first thing I really want to talk about is the part one frames. Now, a frame is a set of questions that are all about the same topic. And after the introduction and identification check, the examiner will use 3 frames to try to ask the candidate a total of 11 questions. Now, the examiner must use either frame 1, which is about where the candidate lives, or frame 2, what you do. So frame 1 and frame 2, there are only 3 questions in those frames. However, in the next 2 frames, those are chosen by the examiner at random, depending on what book he or she has, and each of these frames has 4 questions. A good source to find out what current frames are being used is IELTS Browse. This is a Chinese website where students post questions from the speaking test, and they're usually pretty accurate. Now I want to talk about the timing for part 1. You have the introduction frame, and that usually takes about 30 to 45 seconds, depending on how many questions the examiner asks. They usually want to finish that fairly quickly and move on. There are 3 part 1 frames, like I said before, and that can last between 3 minutes and 45 seconds to about 4 minutes and 30 seconds. So you've got a total of 14 to 16 questions in part 1, and that means that about 17 to 21 seconds would be allowed for each question and answer. In terms of the examiner's role in part 1, the examiner is required to complete the introduction and 3 frames, if it's possible. The examiner needs to attempt to make part 1 at least 4 minutes and 30 seconds long. The examiner cannot make part 1 longer than 5 minutes. All the wording in the questions in part 1 must be read exactly as they're written in the booklet. However, there's some exceptions to this. The examiner must repeat the question if the candidate gives an off-topic response. For example, if they clearly didn't understand what the question was, then the examiner will repeat the question. Or the candidate can ask the examiner, could you repeat the question? Another thing here is the examiner must rephrase or clarify the question if the candidate asks. Now, the candidate will only be able to do this after the first time the examiner asks the question, because the examiner cannot ask a question more than twice in part 1. If they ask a question twice, they're just going to move right along. During the exam, the examiner is assessing all of these, the fluency and coherence, the lexical resource, grammatical range and accuracy, and pronunciation. It's a lot to take in. In addition to the timing, they have to do this. So in part 1, many examiners really only focus on pronunciation and fluency and coherence. A candidate really can't change their pronunciation features much. So that's what a lot of examiners will focus on. The other thing is that a lot of examiners, they know that many candidates have prepared or memorized responses to question 1. So a lot of times they just ignore the grammar and vocabulary that the candidate is using. So what should the candidate do? What kind of a strategy? Well, focus on your pronunciation. Use intonation and stress well when you're speaking in part one. The tone should go up and down, conveying meaning. Group your words together appropriately. We call this chunking. Enunciate. Speak clearly. Be sure that you work on speaking and your word endings, and avoid slow speech. If you use slow speech, it will affect your intonation and stress as well as chunking. I know a lot of people already know this, candidates, people taking the test, but you just have to keep going. Keep speaking until the examiner interrupts you. If you have short terms, and terms mean the time that you are speaking, you probably won't get any higher than a band 5 for your fluency and coherence. You're going to want to speak at a normal rate. In other words, what maybe you would speak in your first language. If you speak slowly, you have long or frequent pauses, or frequently repeat or correct yourself, the examiner will probably give you a band 5 for fluency and coherence. So finally, there's candidates that have some questions after they've taken the test. They wonder, why does the examiner interrupt me so often? Remember that the examiner is trying to complete all 3 frames in under 5 minutes. If they're just managing the time that they have there so that they can give a standard test. If they interrupt you, then you are doing a good job. People wonder, why does the examiner ask me why or why not or how in part 1? If the examiner is asking you these questions, this means that your turns are too short, okay? You're not speaking long enough, and they're trying to get you to use more language so that they can get the test to at least 4 minutes and 30 seconds. So continue to try and make long turns. Another thing people wonder is, why won't the examiner repeat the question? The examiner can only repeat the question once, okay? If you still don't understand, he or she is just going to move on to the next question. I hope this video was helpful to you. Go ahead and like it, subscribe, or leave a comment, ring the bell, and I'll be posting more later. Thank you again.